800 years ago, a man died, and the world changed forever. He was neither born to greatness nor raised in comfort. He started his life on the open steppe, among wild horses, icy winds, and the harsh law of survival. His father was poisoned. His mother left to raise children with nothing, surrounded by enemies. He was called Temujin. Before he became a legend, he was starving, hunted, betrayed by his own kind. But Temujin was not conquered by circumstance, he conquered his fate. With nothing but iron will, sharp mind, and endless patience, he gathered allies in the shadows, built trust among the desperate, united, broken tribes, and challenged a world ruled by fear. Pain was the fabric of his childhood. Every enemy shaped him. Every loss filled him with relentless resolve. From the chaos of captivity and loss, he learned to strike fast, to read weakness in others, to value loyalty above all. He would rise, step by step. First, he rescued his wife Berta from kidnappers, risking death and earning devotion from those who witnessed his spirit. He struck deals, made enemies into friends, turned fear into authority. In a shattered world, Temujin began to build something no Mongol had ever seen: a coalition held together, not by birth, but by loyalty and law. Men who swore allegiance became brothers, regardless of tribe, blood, past betrayals. This was his genius, to dissolve the age-old boundaries, to unify Mongol tribes under one vision, one code, one destiny. By his late 20s, he had survived betrayal, assassination plots, exile, and endless wars among the steppe clans. Still, Temujin pressed on, patient as winter, swift as a hawk. The code he constructed, the Yasa, became his weapon and shield, a new law binding men tighter than any ancient kin. Enemy after enemy fell, and soon word spread. His followers were the fiercest riders, his tactics unpredictable, his justice legendary. He punished betrayal without mercy. He rewarded loyalty without limit. Each victory brought new chiefs, new horses, new warriors, each one bound by oaths that replaced blood with iron. Then came the Great Assembly, the Kurultai. Mongols from every horizon gathered on the banks of the Onon River. Old grudges smoldered. Voices rang out in debate. The wind carried histories of centuries-long feuds. Yet, before the fire, Temujin stood calm, commanding, resolute. Leaders who had once hunted him knelt in the grass, raised their hands, and declared him Genghis Khan, universal ruler, king of kings. At that moment, a man born into exile, grown from the ashes of defeat, became the master of a nation. Not just any nation, but a force that would reshape the face of the earth. But something else happened that morning. Genghis Khan proclaimed unity, but he demanded secrecy. He declared that the glory of Mongol conquest must live on, not in open shrines, not in monuments seen by outsiders, but in the memory of the people. He feared the jealousy of future rulers, the vengeance of conquered nations, the betrayal from within. He knew that to be remembered was to be vulnerable, to be idolized was to invite destruction. So Genghis Khan resolved that his final resting place would never be known. The greatest ruler the world had ever seen decreed that his tomb must remain hidden, lost, invulnerable to time. Why this secrecy? Why would a conqueror, a maker of empires, want to vanish into myth? This is the question that haunts every explorer, every archaeologist, every scholar who studies the Mongol legacy. Some say he feared his enemies. Some say he was obeying ancient steppe traditions. Some say he dreamed that future generations would seek him, yearn to uncover his secrets, but never succeed. Whatever his reason, Genghis Khan's disappearance became the greatest mystery of his legend. The tomb of Khan, where is it? For 8 centuries, everyone who held power in Mongolia kept silent. Every witness to the burial was silenced. every hint to the location was buried, erased, forbidden to be spoken. This silence was more than clever politics. It was the final conquest of a man who bent history to his will. After death, Genghis Khan became a ghost at the very heart of Mongolia, present in every story, absent from every map. Lightning-fast riders, the Keshig Imperial Guard, formed his funeral cortege, traveled deep into the wilderness, burying the king where no living soul could ever find him. The last thing many witnesses ever saw was the sky above the mountains, the trembling grass, the ice-cold wind, and the sound of hooves fading into distance. The burial party itself was reportedly executed to wipe all traces of the tomb, an act designed to ensure that none could betray the final secret. Generations passed. Mongol chiefs, kings, emperors rose and fell. The empire split, raged, faded, but the code of silence endured. The Onon River kept its secrets. Forests and steppes that witnessed the funeral became sacred, forbidden lands. Locals whispered. Outsiders guessed and searched. Yet no truth arrived. Constructed history, tales spun by foreign chroniclers, centuries-old rumors surrounding lost mountains and hidden rivers, none had proof. All had hope. Marco Polo arrived, heard the stories, left with more questions. Russian explorers tried, Chinese scientists tried, but the tomb would not give up its dead. Why does the world obsess over this lost grave? Why does every generation enlist technology, money, faith, and patience to hunt for it? What do we believe we'll find: treasure, bones, ancient wisdom, or the key to the Mongol soul? The answer lies in the shadow of Genghis Khan himself. No conqueror ever approached his scale. He ruled from the Pacific to the Black Sea. He ended kingdoms, birthed dynasties, built global trade routes, changed the course of history in every direction. To find his tomb is to find a piece of our shared past, to touch a mystery rooted in both horror and awe. But Genghis Khan's real achievement wasn't war alone. He built laws where chaos had reigned. He granted freedom of religion in a world ruled by dogma. He promoted merchants, artists, thinkers, scribes. His empire traded ideas, goods, even food across continents. Still, after all the victories, all the progress, Genghis Khan insisted on humble burial, anonymous grave, vanished identity. He returned to the anonymity from which he had come. This paradox makes his tomb the ultimate prize. Whoever finds it will not just solve an ancient puzzle. They will hold the key to understanding the mind of the greatest conqueror that ever lived. Even now, in the age of satellites and artificial intelligence, we search. Every year, expeditions launch, hoping to decipher old riddles, analyze clues, examine soil with radar, negotiate with political powers who fear that discovery could disrupt the fragile balance of myth and memory. Mongolia guards her secrets. The world waits. And the question echoes in the wind across the steppe, as it has for 800 years. Where is Genghis Khan? Somewhere beneath grass and stone, beneath mountain shadow and forest silence, he is waiting. His story began in pain, rose to grandeur amid the clash of empires. But it ends, for now, with the greatest secret yet to be revealed. The search continues, the mystery deepens, and the legacy of the world's greatest conqueror remains hidden, just out of reach, fueling dreams and obsessions across generations. The story that begins with a single orphan, lost and betrayed, ends with a king who disappeared. What can we learn from the man who built the largest empire in history, then chose to vanish when time called him home? This is why we search. This is what draws us deeper. And this is why Genghis Khan's tomb stands as the last great riddle of the ancient world. But before we can understand why Genghis Khan chose to vanish, we must first understand where he came from. We must walk the frozen steppes of Mongolia in the 12th century, We must witness the world that birthed him, shaped him, nearly destroyed him. We must see the Mongolia that existed before Genghis Khan arrived. A Mongolia fractured by endless war, divided by tribal hatred, weakened by constant betrayal. A Mongolia where a man's life meant nothing, where loyalty was a word without meaning, where survival belonged only to those ruthless enough to kill their own brothers. The year was around 1162. Somewhere on the Mongolian plateau, on the banks of the river Onan, a child was born. His mother was Hoylun, wife of a Mongol chieftain. His father was Yesugei, a man of some power, a leader who commanded respect among the scattered tribes. The child was named Temujin. It seemed at first like a birth among nobles. The name itself was taken from a Tatar chief whom Yesugei had defeated, a custom meant to honor the vanquished enemy and bring strength from his defeated spirit. The child had royal blood. The child had a father's protection. The child seemed destined for the life of a tribal leader, perhaps even a great one. But destiny, on the Mongolian steppe, was never guaranteed. Temujin's early life was not one of privilege. When he was only 9 years old, his father was poisoned by rivals, murdered by a Tatar clan seeking vengeance. The death was swift and brutal. Yesugei, traveling with only a few companions, was ambushed, given poisoned wine, and left to die in agony. His death was a catastrophe for the family. Among the Mongols, a fatherless child was prey. A boy without a protector was vulnerable. A widow without a son of fighting age was cast aside, forgotten, erased from the tribe's concerns. Hoylun, Temujin's mother, was left to fend for herself and her young son. She was skilled, intelligent, and fierce. She possessed the knowledge of survival that only a steppe woman could possess. She knew how to hunt, how to make camps, how to read weather, how to preserve food through brutal winters. But skill and knowledge were not enough. The Mongol tribes did not respect weakness. The law of the steppe was simple. The strong devoured the weak. When Hoylun tried to claim her son's inheritance, to assert that young Temujin should take his father's position, the other tribal leaders simply turned away. Some laughed. Some did not even bother to respond. Yesugei's authority died with him. His widow and his children were cast into exile. Hoylun made a decision. She took her children, her daughters, and young Temujin, and fled into the mountains. She fled from the tribe that had rejected her, fled from the relatives who saw her as nothing more than a burden, fled from a world that had no place for the families of fallen leaders. Survival was possible in the mountains, among the forests, far from the politics of tribal rivalry. She could hunt. She could gather roots and plants. She could survive, though her life would be one of constant hardship, constant movement, constant fear. Young Temujin learned the lessons of exile from his earliest years. He learned that the world was cruel. He learned that family could not be trusted. He learned that loyalty was rare and precious. He learned that power was the only thing that mattered, because power meant survival. He learned to watch, to listen, to read people, to understand when someone was about to betray you, to sense danger in voices and glances. These were not lessons learned from books or teachers. These were lessons learned from watching his mother navigate a world that seemed designed to crush her. Every day was a lesson in cunning, in patience, in the careful calculation of when to trust and when to strike. But even in exile, even in the mountains where Hoylun had taken her children to be safe, there was no escape from the violence and politics of the Mongol world. When Temujin was around 13 years old, he encountered a young man named Tatars. The encounter seemed innocent, almost friendly. Tatars was from a rival clan, but Temujin, already showing the sharp intelligence that would define him, suspected something. He suspected that the Tatars wanted to harm him. He suspected that this encounter was not accidental. And he was right. Tatars attacked him. But Temujin fought back with a fury that surprised everyone. He fought with the desperation of someone who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. He survived. Tatars fled. But the encounter had changed something in young Temujin. He had tasted violence. He had learned that he could survive it. He had learned that within him burned a fire, a rage, a will to power that would not be extinguished. Around this same time, Temujin was walking by a river when he encountered another young man. This young man was named Jamuka. Jamuka would become one of the most important figures in Temujin's early life. Jamuka was also of noble birth, also a prince of his tribe, also destined for greatness. At first, the two boys formed a bond. They swore friendship oaths to each other. They spoke the language of eternal brotherhood, of loyalty, of union. Temujin and Jamuka promised that they would never betray each other, that they would stand together against all enemies, that they would share everything. In the world of the Mongol steppe, where trust was rare and betrayal was common, such oaths were sacred. They meant something. They created bonds that could survive hardship, battle, and separation. But even as Temujin and Jamuka swore their oaths of brotherhood, even as they spoke of eternal loyalty, the seeds of future conflict were being planted. Both boys were destined to be leaders. Both possessed the intelligence, the will, and the charisma necessary to command others. Both dreamed of power. And in the Mongol world, there was not room for two dreamers. Eventually, there would be only one. Eventually, one would have to destroy the other. This is the tragic arc of their relationship. It begins with genuine affection and brotherhood, but it ends in war. Temujin's childhood was not one continuous story of hardship. There were moments of wonder, moments of learning, moments when the young man discovered who he truly was. He learned to ride before he could walk properly. Mongol children were taught horsemanship as their first language, and Temujin was a natural. He could direct a horse with only his legs and whispers. He could ride for hours without tiring. He could turn in the saddle and hit a target with an arrow while moving at full gallop. These skills would define his military genius later. The Mongol horse was small, hardy, and capable of surviving on the toughest grass. In Temujin's hands, these horses became weapons. They became the instrument through which his dreams of conquest would be realized. When Temujin reached his late teens, his life took another violent turn. He was now recognized as a young man of potential, a warrior of growing reputation. But potential meant nothing in a world where power was the only currency. When Temujin attended a gathering of tribes, he was captured by a rival clan. He was put in chains. He was imprisoned, treated as a slave, awaiting death. The capture could have ended his story. He could have been killed, buried in some anonymous grave, forgotten within a generation. But Temujin escaped. He broke free from his chains, fled into the night, and vanished into the darkness. The escape became legend. People began to whisper about the young warrior who could not be held, who could not be kept, who seemed blessed by the gods themselves. After his escape from captivity, Temujin began to gather followers, not soldiers, not warriors trained in an army. He gathered the outcasts, the broken, the betrayed. He gathered men whose fathers had been killed, men whose tribes had rejected them, men who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. He gathered men like himself, men born into hardship, forged by suffering, desperate to prove themselves. He offered these men something unique. He offered them equality. In a world where tribe determined everything, where birth determined your place, Temujin offered the possibility of rising based on merit alone. If you were loyal, if you fought well, if you followed his code, you would be rewarded. Your origin did not matter. Your past did not matter. What mattered was your loyalty and your willingness to fight for the vision he was building. This was revolutionary. The Mongol tribes were built on kinship. Your status was determined by your family. Your future was written before you were born. But Temujin created something different. He created a meritocracy. He promoted based on ability. He trusted capable men regardless of their origins. He took warriors from different tribes, different families, and welded them together into a fighting force unlike anything the steppe had ever seen. These men became his keshig, his imperial guard, his most trusted warriors. They would follow him anywhere. They would die for him without hesitation, and more importantly, they would keep his secrets. They would be the men who would eventually know the location of his tomb. And they would die to protect that secret. As Temujin grew older, he began to understand the politics of the steppe more deeply. He realized that the constant warfare between tribes was weakening all Mongols. He saw that if the tribes could be united, if they could direct their violence outward rather than inward, they could become unstoppable. He began to articulate a vision of unity, of strength through cooperation, of a code of law that would bind all Mongols together. This vision was radical. It went against everything the tribal leaders believed. It threatened their power, their independence, their ability to rule their own territories as they saw fit. But Temujin was patient. He was willing to wait. He was willing to build his power slowly, carefully, methodically. He formed alliances, not through marriage or kinship, but through respect and demonstrated loyalty. He defeated enemies and then, instead of destroying them, he offered them the choice of joining him. He said to them, "Join me, bring your warriors, follow my code, and you will be treated as equals. You will be honored. You will participate in decisions. You will share in the spoils of conquest." Many refused. Many were killed. But enough accepted that his power grew, steadily, relentlessly, like a fire spreading across dry grass. By Temujin's late 20s and early 30s, something was becoming clear to everyone on the Mongolian steppe. This man was different. This man had power. This man had vision. This man could not be defeated. The tribes that had mocked him when he was young, that had rejected him when his father died, that had tried to enslave him or kill him, these same tribes began to see him differently. They began to see him as their possible master. Then came the conflict with Jamuka, his brother in oath, his childhood friend. The two men who had sworn eternal loyalty to each other became rivals. The reasons for the split are debated by historians. Some say it was a fundamental disagreement about how to organize the Mongol tribes. Some say it was simply the inevitable clash of two ambitious men who could not share power. Some say it was motivated by an insult, a perceived betrayal. Whatever the reason, the friendship ended. Jamuka began to gather his own followers. Jamuka began to challenge Temujin's authority. The two childhood friends became bitter enemies. The battle between Temujin and Jamuka was fierce. They fought for years. At one point, it seemed that Jamuka might win. At another point, Temujin was nearly destroyed. But in the end, Temujin's superior tactics, his ability to inspire loyalty, his relentless will, prevailed. Jamuka was defeated. Temujin, showing the ruthlessness that would define his later conquests, executed his childhood friend. The man who had sworn eternal brotherhood with Temujin died by his order. This act was brutal. It was also necessary. In the Mongol world, there was no room for rivals, there was no room for divided loyalty, there could be only one ruler. And Temujin had decided that he would be that one. By 1206, Temujin's position was unassailable. The tribes had been united under his authority. The chaos that had defined the Mongolian steppe for centuries had been brought under control through force and through the promise of a new order. A great assembly was called, the Kurultai, and leaders from across Mongolia gathered. In the presence of these leaders, Temujin was proclaimed Khan, the ruler of all Mongols. His title was expanded. He was given the name Genghis Khan, meaning the oceanic ruler or universal ruler. The ceremony was solemn and sacred. A new age was beginning. Genghis Khan was no longer the starving boy whose father had been poisoned. He was no longer the exile, the prisoner, the hunted man. He was the supreme ruler of the Mongolian tribes. He was the leader of a unified nation. And he was only in his mid-40s, still vigorous, still energetic, still hungry for greatness. The world did not yet know what was about to happen. The world did not yet understand that the birth of Genghis Khan meant the birth of an unprecedented power. The world did not yet realize that a man had just been crowned who would reshape history, who would expand his empire across continents, who would become the greatest conqueror ever to live. And it was at this moment, during this triumph, when his power was absolute and his future seemed limitless, that Genghis Khan made a decision that would haunt history for the next 800 years, a decision that would create the mystery we are still trying to solve today. Genghis Khan decreed that his final resting place would be hidden, that his tomb would be lost, that his burial would be shrouded in secrecy, that no man should ever know where the Khan had been laid to rest. Now that Genghis Khan held absolute power over Mongolia, now that the tribes had sworn allegiance to him, now that the foundation of his empire had been laid, he faced a choice that would define not just his reign, but the entire course of human history. He could have rested. He could have enjoyed his power. He could have consolidated his control, settled into his role as Supreme Khan, and watched his successors inherit the throne. But Genghis Khan was not a man of rest. Genghis Khan was not satisfied with local dominance. He looked at the world beyond the steppe, and he saw targets. He saw empires waiting to be conquered. He saw wealth waiting to be seized. He saw the possibility of reshaping the entire globe according to his vision. And he began to form a plan so audacious, so comprehensive, that no military leader in history had ever dared to imagine it. The world in the early 13th century was vast, divided, and largely unaware of each other. The Jin dynasty ruled northern China, a sophisticated state with centuries of tradition, advanced military technology, and enormous resources. To the west, the Tangut Kingdom controlled trade routes and mountain passes. Further west, the Islamic empires of Central Asia, from Persia to the Khwarezm, controlled the great trading cities, the centers of commerce, the hubs where silk, spices, and ideas flowed between east and west. To the south, the Song dynasty ruled southern China, wealthier perhaps than any kingdom on earth, with innovations in naval technology and manufacturing that no other civilization could match. To the west, beyond even these empires, lay Europe, fragmented into kingdoms, principalities, and fiefdoms, each focused on local wars and local politics. These empires knew of each other, but they did not truly understand each other. They did not recognize that they were about to be forever changed by a man from the steppe. They did not realize that the age of isolated regional powers was coming to an end. They did not comprehend that history was about to accelerate, to compress, to become something entirely different. To them, Genghis Khan was either unknown or simply another steppe raider, the kind of tribal leader that had threatened their borders for centuries. They did not see him as existential threat. They did not understand that he was about to do something unprecedented. He was about to unite the entire Eurasian continent under a single rule. Genghis Khan understood something that most military leaders of his era did not comprehend. He understood that conquest was not merely about having a larger army or more sophisticated weapons. Conquest was about organization, about logistics, about supply lines, about communication across vast distances. He understood that to hold an empire, you needed not just soldiers, but administrators, diplomats, spies, merchants who could manage territory and extract resources. He understood that an empire was not built through military victories alone, but through the creation of systems, structures, and institutions that could function across continents and centuries. So Genghis Khan began to build, not just an army, but a military machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. The Mongol warriors were already famous for their horsemanship, their archery, their mobility. But Genghis Khan took these natural talents and refined them. He developed cavalry tactics that were decades ahead of their time. He invented signaling systems that allowed commanders to coordinate movements across vast distances. He created a chain of command that was both rigid and flexible, capable of rapid response to changing circumstances. He trained his soldiers not just to fight, but to think, to adapt, to solve problems on the battlefield without waiting for orders from headquarters. The Mongol army was organized in decimal units, tens, hundreds, thousands, 10,000s. Each unit had a commander responsible for discipline, training, and performance. Officers were promoted based on merit, not birth. A skilled warrior of common origin could rise to command thousands of men. This meritocratic system was revolutionary in an era when most armies were structured according to aristocratic privilege. It meant that Genghis Khan's army was led by his best men, not by his nobles. It meant that the army was stronger, faster, more intelligent than armies led by aristocrats chosen for their lineage rather than their ability. Genghis Khan also revolutionized military technology and tactics. The Mongols had always been known for their mastery of the composite bow, a weapon that required years of practice to use effectively. In the hands of a Mongol warrior, this bow was devastatingly accurate at distances where other archers' arrows fell harmlessly short. The composite bow could pierce armor. It could kill from a distance. A single Mongol archer could engage an enemy from a position where the enemy could not effectively respond. Combined with cavalry mobility, the composite bow became a weapon of total domination. But the Mongol innovations went beyond individual weapons. They pioneered new tactics of psychological warfare. They understood that terror was a weapon. They understood that the reputation of an army could be as valuable as the army itself. When they approached a city, they often sent emissaries demanding surrender. They explained in detail what would happen if the city resisted. They described the siege machines they would deploy. They depicted the fate of those who had resisted in the past. Many cities surrendered without a fight, simply because the psychological pressure was too great. The Mongols had learned to use information and communication as weapons of war. Genghis Khan also understood something that other rulers of his era overlooked: the importance of supply lines. An army marches on its stomach. An army without adequate food, water, and shelter will collapse regardless of how brave the soldiers are. Genghis Khan created supply systems that were remarkable for their sophistication. He established way stations along established routes. He created systems to requisition supplies from conquered territory. He understood that his army needed to move fast, which meant it needed to travel light, which meant it needed to be resupplied from the land itself. He developed the capacity to feed tens of thousands of soldiers moving across deserts and mountains, through territories where local populations had been devastated by previous campaigns. The first great conquest was the Jin dynasty. The Jin ruled northern China, a wealthy empire with centuries of tradition and sophisticated military organization. To the Jin emperors, Genghis Khan seemed like an interesting threat, but not a critical one. They had dealt with steppe raiders for centuries. They believed that their walls, their fortifications, their advanced military technology would protect them. But Genghis Khan understood that the Jin had weaknesses. He understood that the Jin military was trained for siege warfare, for defending fixed positions. The Mongol tactics were designed for mobile warfare, for using speed and flexibility to overwhelm static defenses. The campaign against the Jin began around 1205 and continued for nearly 2 decades. It was a war of conquest unlike anything the Jin had experienced. The Mongols did not content themselves with attacking frontier settlements. They penetrated deep into Jin territory. They besieged major cities. They defeated Jin armies in open battle. They discovered that while the Jin had superior military equipment and fortifications, the Mongols had superior strategy and superior soldiers. The Jin had been trained to defend their homeland. The Mongols had been trained to conquer foreign territory. It was a mismatch, and eventually the Jin Empire collapsed. By the early 1220s, the Jin had been forced to abdicate, and northern China was under Mongol control. But Genghis Khan did not stop with the Jin. Even as the conquest of China was ongoing, he turned his attention to the west. He heard of the Khwarezm Empire, a vast Islamic state that controlled trade routes and wealthy cities. He heard of merchants, caravanserais, bazaars filled with silks, spices, and precious materials. He heard of the wealth that flowed through Central Asia, the riches that could be seized, the resources that could be extracted. In 1219, Genghis Khan led an army west. The Khwarezm Shah, the ruler of the Khwarezm Empire, made a critical mistake. He believed his empire was too powerful to be threatened. He believed that the Mongols were too far away, too poorly supplied, too distant from their homeland to pose a serious threat. He was wrong. The Mongol invasion of Khwarezm was catastrophic for the Shah's empire. Genghis Khan deployed his army with a precision that was terrifying. He divided his forces, attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. He used deception and intelligence to strike at weak points in the imperial defense. He moved with speed that the Shah's armies could not match. Within months, Khwarezm was conquered. The capital city of Samarkand, one of the most famous cities in the world, fell to the Mongols. The conquest was total and devastating. The Shah himself fled, eventually dying in exile on an island in the Caspian Sea. From Khwarezm, the Mongol conquests continued westward. Genghis Khan sent armies into the Caucasus and southern Russia. He defeated the Cumans, a nomadic people who tried to resist the Mongol advance. He pushed toward Europe itself. Other armies were sent to the east to complete the conquest of China. Within a single generation, the Mongol Empire had expanded to control territory from the Pacific Ocean to the Black Sea, the largest continuous land empire that had ever existed in human history. But the conquests were not achieved through military force alone. Genghis Khan understood that to hold an empire, you needed more than soldiers. You needed administrators, tax collectors, judges, merchants. You needed systems to govern the conquered territories. You needed ways to extract resources without completely destroying the economic base. You needed methods to prevent rebellion and maintain order across vast distances. Genghis Khan created the Yasa, a legal code that applied to all Mongols and their subjects. The Yasa was remarkably advanced for its time. It guaranteed freedom of religion. It protected merchants and trade. It established rules for fair taxation. It created a system of justice that was applied uniformly across the empire. This legal framework was revolutionary. In most medieval empires, the law varied from region to region. Different provinces had different customs, different codes, different methods of justice. Genghis Khan imposed a single legal framework across his entire empire. This created stability and predictability. It encouraged trade and commerce because merchants knew they would be treated fairly regardless of which province they were in. It allowed local populations to maintain many of their customs while still being subject to overall imperial authority. It was a system of governance that was both centralized and flexible, both rigid in its core principles and adaptable to local circumstances. Genghis Khan also revolutionized communication across his empire. He established a postal system, the Yam, which allowed messages to be transmitted across thousands of miles with a speed that was unprecedented for the era. Riders would change horses at stations positioned at regular intervals. A message could travel from the eastern edges of the empire to the western edges in a matter of weeks, instead of the months it would have taken with a single rider traveling continuously. This postal system was not just for military purposes. It was used for commerce, for administration, for government. It was a system that held the empire together across vast distances. The Mongol Empire was not just a military conquest, it was also an economic revolution. The Mongols, who controlled the Great Silk Road, began to facilitate trade on an unprecedented scale. They guaranteed safe passage to merchants traveling through their territory. They reduced taxes on trade goods, making commerce more profitable. They used their military power to suppress bandits and ensure that trade routes were secure. The result was an explosion of commerce. Goods from China, India, and the Middle East began to flow to Europe. European goods began to flow eastward. For the first time, a truly global trade network began to form. The Mongol Empire was the mechanism that made this possible. Genghis Khan's conquests were also marked by an intellectual openness that was remarkable for the era. He did not simply destroy the civilizations he conquered, he absorbed their knowledge. He employed skilled craftsmen, engineers, physicians, and scholars from the territories he conquered. He valued expertise regardless of the ethnicity or religion of the expert. He collected ideas, technologies, and innovations from across his empire and spread them throughout his dominions. Chinese innovations in gunpowder were transmitted westward. Persian innovations in architecture and administration were spread eastward. Knowledge that had been isolated in specific regions began to circulate across the entire civilized world. But this openness and intellectual curiosity coexisted with a ruthlessness that was almost incomprehensible. When cities resisted, Genghis Khan showed no mercy. He would massacre entire populations as a demonstration to other cities that resistance was futile. He would execute the leadership of conquered territories while preserving the common people. He would be generous to those who submitted voluntarily, but merciless to those who forced him to conquer by force. This combination of brutality and pragmatism was terrifying. It meant that cities had to calculate carefully. Was it better to resist and risk total destruction, or to surrender and preserve at least some portion of their population and resources? The result was that many cities chose to surrender. They calculated that submission was preferable to destruction. This meant that Genghis Khan could conquer vast territories with relatively small losses of life compared to what the destruction would have been had every city fought to the last resident. It was a system of calculated terror, carefully calibrated to achieve his objectives while minimizing resistance. By the time Genghis Khan reached his 60s, he had conquered an empire larger than any that had existed before. He had created a political system that was more advanced than most of the states he had conquered. He had facilitated a level of global trade and communication that would not be matched again until the age of European colonialism nearly 4 centuries later. He had united peoples from dozens of different cultures, religions, and ethnicities under a single umbrella. He had transformed the world. And yet, even at the height of his power, even as his empire stretched across continents, even as his name was feared and respected from Korea to Hungary, Genghis Khan was aware of his mortality. He was aware that empires did not last forever, that successors often proved unequal to their predecessors, that the great works of one generation could be dismantled by the failures of another. He was aware that his body was aging, that his time on earth was limited, that death would eventually come for him as it came for all men. It was with this awareness, with this understanding of mortality and impermanence, that Genghis Khan made his decision. He decided that his tomb would be hidden. He decided that his burial would be secret. He decided that no one would ever find where he had been laid to rest. It was not a decision made in anger or in desperation. It was a deliberate choice, calculated and intentional. And it revealed something profound about the way Genghis Khan understood power, legacy, and mortality. Genghis Khan understood that a tomb was not just a place where a body was buried. A tomb was a focus of power, a place where pilgrims could come to venerate the dead, a place that could become a rallying point for those who opposed the living ruler. He understood that if he left behind a visible tomb, if he left behind a shrine, if he left behind a place of pilgrimage, that place could become a challenge to the authority of his successors. He understood that future generations might use his tomb as a symbol, as a focus for loyalty to his memory rather than to the living ruler. He understood that his physical remains, once they could be accessed and seen, became a kind of competing center of power with the living government. So he decided to vanish. He decided to deny posterity even the basic satisfaction of knowing where the greatest conqueror in history had been laid to rest. It was the final act of a man who had bent the world to his will. Even in death, even after his body had ceased to function, he would maintain control. Even after he was gone, he would exercise power by denying knowledge, by creating mystery, by leaving behind an unsolved puzzle that would haunt future generations. But the mystery of Genghis Khan's tomb is not simply an ancient puzzle left unsolved. It is not merely a historical question lacking an answer. The mystery exists because of deliberate choices made by Genghis Khan and his successors, choices rooted in political calculation and spiritual belief. To understand the mystery, we must understand what evidence survived, what records were kept, and what the Mongol elite decided to reveal or conceal about the Khan's death and burial. We must examine the documents that came down to us, the historical accounts written by those who lived during or shortly after Genghis Khan's life, and decipher what they tell us about what happened in those final days and what happened after. The primary sources we have about Genghis Khan's death and burial come from various chroniclers who lived in the regions conquered by the Mongols. These were men who had access to court records, who had interviewed people who had been present during important events, who had collected information about the Khan from multiple sources. The most important of these chroniclers was Rashid al-Din, a Persian historian who lived in the early 14th century, more than 70 years after Genghis Khan's death. Rashid al-Din had access to Mongol records, to accounts from eyewitnesses, to the accumulated knowledge of the Mongol court. His chronicle, the Jami al-Tawarikh, is one of the most comprehensive accounts we have of Genghis Khan's life and reign. Another crucial source is Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant who traveled through the Mongol Empire in the late 13th century. Marco Polo did not meet Genghis Khan, who had died decades before his journey. But Marco Polo traveled through the Khan's empire, visited the places where the Khan had ruled, and collected stories and legends about him from the people he encountered. Marco Polo's account, recorded in his famous book, The Travels of Marco Polo, provides us with observations about the Mongol world, about the legacy of Genghis Khan, about the reverence in which his memory was held. Though Marco Polo did not know where the Khan was buried, his observations help us understand the spiritual significance that the Khan held for the Mongol people. Chinese historical records also provide important information. The Chinese, who had been conquered by Genghis Khan and his immediate successors, kept meticulous records of historical events. These records document the Khan's military campaigns, his administrative reforms, his relations with the Chinese court. While Chinese historians often viewed Genghis Khan with a mixture of fear and grudging respect, they recognized his historical importance and recorded details about his life and death. The Song dynasty records, the Jin dynasty records, and later the Yuan dynasty records all contain information relevant to understanding Genghis Khan and his burial. But what is striking about all these sources is not what they say about Genghis Khan's burial, but what they do not say. The accounts mention that Genghis Khan died. The accounts describe his military campaigns, his administrative achievements, his family. But when it comes to the location of his burial, the accounts become vague, evasive, even contradictory. Some sources say that his body was taken to a particular mountain. Other sources name a different location. Some sources explicitly state that the location was kept secret. Other sources seem to imply that the location was known but should not be revealed. This pattern of vagueness and contradiction is itself significant. It suggests that there was deliberate suppression of information. It suggests that different chroniclers had different levels of access to the truth. It suggests that some sources may have intentionally provided false information to mislead those searching for the Khan's burial place. This strategy of deliberate misinformation was entirely consistent with what Genghis Khan had wanted. He wanted the location to be hidden. He wanted those who came after him to maintain the secrecy. If different false stories circulated, if different locations were mentioned in different sources, then no one could ever be certain which account, if any, was accurate. One of the most intriguing pieces of evidence comes from an obscure reference in a Persian chronicle. The chronicler mentions that Genghis Khan's funeral cortege traveled to a location in the Khenti Mountains, in the region of Mongolia near the Onon River. The chronicler suggests that the Khan's body was placed in a grave, and that soldiers on horseback rode back and forth over the grave to conceal its location. The soldiers would have obliterated any visible markers, any physical evidence that something had been buried at that spot. Over time, as the grass grew and the earth settled, the grave would have become indistinguishable from the surrounding steppe. No one who did not already know where it was would be able to locate it. This account has the ring of authenticity about it. It is consistent with steppe burial practices. It is consistent with what we know of Mongol customs. It explains how a grave could be completely hidden while still receiving a proper burial. It answers the practical question of how Genghis Khan could have been buried without leaving any visible marker. But the account is not entirely reliable. We do not know the source from which the chronicler obtained this information. We do not know if the chronicler was accurate in reporting what he was told. We do not know if the location described is accurate or if it is a false lead deliberately planted to mislead future searchers. Another significant piece of evidence comes from the later Mongol practice of designating certain regions as sacred and forbidding them from ordinary exploitation. After Genghis Khan's death, Mongol rulers designated the Khenti Mountains as a sacred region. Hunting was forbidden there. Settlement was forbidden. Only the most important Mongol ceremonies were performed there. This prohibition lasted for centuries. In some parts of Mongolia, the prohibition persists even today. The fact that such a specific region was declared sacred and protected suggests that something important was buried there, something worth protecting, something worth maintaining in secrecy. But this evidence, while suggestive, is not conclusive. The Mongols may have designated this region as sacred for other reasons. They may have believed that the region had spiritual significance independent of Genghis Khan's burial. They may have wanted to protect certain sacred sites, certain mountains or rivers for religious reasons. The designation of the region as sacred does not necessarily prove that Genghis Khan was buried there. It is consistent with the hypothesis, but it does not confirm it. The accounts of Genghis Khan's death itself are also conflicting. According to some sources, the Khan died in his tent of a sudden illness. According to other sources, he died of an infected wound from an arrow, received during a hunting accident or during combat. According to yet other sources, he was assassinated by one of his wives or by a rival. The accounts differ on crucial details like the location of his death, the time of year, and the cause. This variation suggests that the historical record was corrupted, either through genuine confusion or through deliberate falsification. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that Genghis Khan died around 1227, at an advanced age for the era, probably in his 60s. His death occurred at a time when the Mongol Empire was expanding rapidly, when campaigns in China and Central Asia were ongoing, when the Khan was still actively involved in directing military operations. The timing of his death, during the midst of ongoing conquests, may have been significant. Some scholars have theorized that Genghis Khan deliberately kept his death secret for a period of time, allowing his successors to consolidate power before announcing publicly that the Khan had died. This would have prevented any potential challenges to the succession during a vulnerable period. According to the accounts, Genghis Khan's body was treated according to Mongol burial customs. This likely involved a period of ritual preparation, the removal of the body to a sacred location, and the performance of burial ceremonies. The exact nature of these ceremonies is not well documented. The Mongols were not a particularly ritualistic people in the way that sedentary civilizations were. Their burial practices were relatively simple and practical. A body might be placed in the earth, or it might be exposed to allow the elements and scavenging animals to return it to nature. The specific practices varied depending on the rank of the deceased and the circumstances of death. For Genghis Khan, given his supreme status, the burial was likely conducted with great ceremony and great secrecy. The highest-ranking Mongol officials would have participated. The most trusted members of the Keshig would have been present. Religious rituals would have been performed. Shamanic priests would have been called upon to perform ceremonies designed to guide the Khan's spirit to the afterlife. These ceremonies would have been conducted in secret, away from the eyes of ordinary people, away from the eyes of conquered peoples who might have used the occasion to rebel or challenge Mongol authority. One of the most intriguing aspects of the burial was the treatment of the funeral attendants. According to historical accounts, some or all of the people who were present at the burial, who had conducted the ceremonies, who knew the location of the grave, were subsequently executed. The purpose was clear: to ensure that no one could ever reveal the location. This practice of executing the funeral party was unusual, even by Mongol standards. It demonstrates the extreme importance that Genghis Khan attached to keeping his burial place secret. He was willing to sacrifice the lives of his most trusted followers in order to maintain this secrecy. He was willing to commit what most people would consider a horrific act in order to achieve his goal. The execution of the funeral attendants also served a psychological purpose. It sent a message to the Mongol people and to the world at large. It demonstrated the absolute seriousness with which Genghis Khan's final wishes were to be treated. It made clear that anyone who violated the sanctity of the tomb, anyone who attempted to disturb the Khan's remains, would face the most severe consequences. The dead were sacred in Mongol belief, but Genghis Khan's grave was more than merely sacred. It was a boundary that could not be crossed, a command that could not be disobeyed, a violation of which would constitute the ultimate blasphemy. After the burial, the secret was maintained through a combination of deliberate suppression and deliberate disinformation. Mongol rulers who succeeded Genghis Khan made it clear that discussing the location of the Khan's burial was forbidden. Those who spoke about it risked severe punishment. At the same time, false stories were circulated. Various locations were named. Various accounts were spread. If 100 different people claimed 100 different locations, then no searcher could be confident about any single location. The result was a kind of information chaos, a deliberate obscuring of the truth through the propagation of false information. This strategy of disinformation was remarkably effective. For 800 years, no one has been able to definitively locate Genghis Khan's tomb. Dozens of expeditions have searched. Hundreds of theories have been proposed. Scholars from different countries and different disciplines have applied their expertise to the problem. Yet the mystery remains unsolved. The tomb remains hidden. The exact location remains unknown. Genghis Khan achieved in death what he had sought. He vanished from the world's sight, leaving behind only questions, mysteries, and legends. The silence that surrounds Genghis Khan's burial is remarkable when compared to other great historical figures. Timur the Conqueror, who lived a century after Genghis Khan and who in some ways emulated his style of conquest, left behind a visible tomb in Samarkand that still stands today. The pyramids of Egypt, built millennia before Genghis Khan, are visible monuments that have been known to history for thousands of years. The tombs of Chinese emperors, though often hidden and difficult to access, have been located and documented by archaeologists. But Genghis Khan's tomb remains hidden. No monument marks his burial place. No inscription commemorates his death. He has vanished as completely as if he had never lived, despite being one of the most important figures in human history. The legend grew around the mystery. Over centuries, the fact that Genghis Khan's burial place was unknown elevated his status to something almost supernatural. Stories circulated that he had not truly died, that he had ascended to heaven, that he had transformed into a spirit who continued to watch over the Mongol people. Some accounts suggested that the Khan was buried standing up, or that he was buried with vast treasures, or that his tomb was guarded by magical forces. These legends, while having no factual basis, served an important function. They transformed Genghis Khan from a historical figure into a mythological one. They elevated him from the status of a human being, subject to death and decay like all other humans, to the status of something transcendent, something eternal, something that could not be fully comprehended by ordinary people. the Mongol people themselves came to view the hidden tomb as sacred in the most profound sense. They viewed it not as a place that was hidden due to practical political considerations, but as a place that had been removed from the earthly realm, that existed in a kind of parallel spiritual universe. To attempt to find the tomb was seen not just as disrespectful, but as spiritually dangerous. It was seen as an invitation for divine punishment, as a violation of cosmic order, as an act that could bring calamity not just on the individual who attempted it, but on the entire Mongol people. This transformation of the tomb into something sacred, something beyond the physical world, was perhaps the ultimate success of Genghis Khan's strategy. He had wanted his burial place to be hidden. It was hidden. He had wanted it to be protected. It was protected, not just by guards or secrecy, but by the spiritual conviction of the Mongol people that the tomb should remain hidden. He had wanted his memory to be preserved in a particular form, transformed into legend rather than remaining as simple history. His memory had been transformed in precisely this way. Yet knowledge of the approximate location of the tomb persisted in the oral traditions of Mongolia. Herdsmen and locals in the region of the Khenti Mountains, the region of the Onon River, maintained stories passed down through generations about where the Khan might be buried. Some families claimed to have knowledge of the location. Some local traditions marked certain areas as sacred, as places where no one was supposed to venture. Some place names seemed to preserve memories of the Khan's presence. In this way, the secret that was supposed to be absolute, that was supposed to be completely hidden, was partially preserved in the collective memory of ordinary Mongolians, even as it remained hidden from the world at large. Yet, despite all the efforts to maintain secrecy, despite all the precautions taken to protect the location of Genghis Khan's tomb, something unexpected happened. As centuries passed, as the direct link between the Khan and the living elite was severed by generation after generation of succession, as the Mongol Empire fragmented and eventually collapsed, the secret itself began to fade. Not because the secret was revealed, but because the people who held it died. The Mongol ruling class that had guarded the Khan's burial for centuries gradually lost power. The Mongol Khans who succeeded one another, each promising to preserve the sacred trust, eventually proved unable to maintain political control. By the time the Ming dynasty conquered Mongolia in the late 14th century, the era of Mongol political dominance was over. The secret, which had been guarded with such dedication, which had been protected with such ferocity, began to slip away. What happened after the collapse of Mongol political power was the gradual erosion of the certainty about Genghis Khan's tomb. Where once there had been a clear understanding among the Mongol elite that certain areas were sacred, that certain locations must not be disturbed, that certain knowledge must not be shared, there now emerged confusion, competing theories, and fragmented memories. Different Mongol families claimed different knowledge about the location. Different tribal traditions preserved different stories. Some insisted that the Khan was buried in one location. Others insisted that he was buried in a different location. The unanimous silence that had lasted for centuries began to fracture. The fragmentation of knowledge about the tomb's location coincided with a broader transformation of Mongolian society. As political power shifted to the Ming dynasty, as Mongol authority contracted to ever smaller territories, as the Mongol people underwent a process of cultural change and adaptation, the reverence for Genghis Khan remained, but it transformed. He was no longer the living presence, the sacred founder whose tomb must be protected at all costs. He became instead a figure of history, a legendary ancestor, a symbol of past glory. The spiritual significance of his tomb remained, but the political urgency of keeping it secret diminished. This transformation was reflected in changing attitudes toward exploration and scholarship. In the centuries immediately after Genghis Khan's death, when Mongol power was at its height, no one would have dared to publicly search for the Khan's tomb. To do so would have been sacrilege, a violation of the Khan's explicit wishes, an act that would have brought punishment from the ruling elite. But as Mongol power waned, as the spiritual authority of the Mongol establishment weakened, outsiders began to explore the possibility of locating the Khan's burial place. European travelers, Chinese scholars, adventurers of various kinds began to speculate about where the Khan might be buried. They began to propose theories, to suggest locations, to encourage expeditions to search for the tomb. Some of these early explorers, traveling through Mongolia in subsequent centuries, encountered local traditions and stories about the Khan's burial. They interviewed herdsmen who claimed knowledge of sacred locations. They examined old maps and documents that supposedly contained clues. They tried to correlate different historical accounts to identify a consistent location. Some concluded that the Khan was buried in the Khenti Mountains. Others believed that the Onon River Valley was the true location. Still others proposed entirely different sites, locations in different parts of Mongolia that seemed to fit various historical accounts. But none of these early explorations, conducted with the resources available in the 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, were able to produce definitive proof of the tomb's location. The explorers could not dig up entire mountain ranges. They could not systematically survey vast territories without modern technology. They could not conclusively identify which historical account was accurate and which were deliberate falsehoods. The mystery remained. The tomb remained hidden. Genghis Khan's secret was preserved not through active suppression, but through the simple fact that the physical remains had been hidden so well that no one possessed the tools necessary to find them. The 19th century brought new developments. European interest in Central Asia and Mongolia intensified. Russian explorers, seeking to expand Russian influence in the region, began to conduct systematic explorations of Mongolian territory. Some of these explorers were interested in locating Genghis Khan's tomb as a matter of geographic knowledge and historical curiosity. They consulted with Mongolian guides and scholars. They examined local traditions. They proposed theories about the location. But even with the more advanced resources available in the 19th century, the search was unsuccessful. The tomb remained hidden. In the 20th century, the search for Genghis Khan's tomb took on new dimensions. Archaeologists, employing scientific methods, began to approach the problem systematically. They analyzed historical accounts, comparing them for consistency and plausibility. They conducted interviews with Mongolian elders and local experts. They examined geographic features that seemed to match descriptions in historical chronicles. They surveyed areas that seemed most likely to contain the tomb. But the 20th century, despite its technological advances, despite its organizational capabilities, despite the resources that could be marshaled for such a search, did not solve the mystery either. Part of the problem was political. Mongolia, which had been liberated from Chinese control in 1911, fell under Soviet influence during the 20th century. The Soviet Union, while not actively suppressing the search for Genghis Khan's tomb, did not encourage it. The Soviets viewed Genghis Khan as a symbol of imperial conquest, a figure whose memory could inspire Mongolian nationalism and threaten Soviet control over the region. Limiting access to sensitive areas, restricting exploration in zones deemed important for national security, preventing foreign expeditions from operating freely in Mongolian territory, all of these Soviet policies had the effect of limiting the search for the Khan's tomb. Additionally, many Mongolian people, even after the fall of the Mongol Empire, continued to view Genghis Khan's tomb as sacred. They believed that the Khan had wanted his burial place to remain hidden. They believed that respecting this wish was important, not just for honoring the Khan, but for maintaining cosmic balance. To attempt to find the tomb, to disturb the sacred ground where the Khan rested, was seen by many Mongolians as spiritually dangerous, as risking the wrath of the Khan's spirit, as potentially bringing misfortune on the land. This spiritual resistance to the search has persisted even to the present day. While international scientists have become increasingly interested in locating the tomb, many Mongolians remain opposed to any disturbance of sacred areas. The Khenti Mountains and surrounding regions in Mongolia remain designated as off-limits in many respects. Certain valleys are forbidden for ordinary development or resource extraction. Certain areas remain virtually unexplored, not due to physical barriers, but due to cultural taboos and religious beliefs. Local Mongolian families have maintained oral traditions about sacred places that should not be disturbed. Some families claim to be descendants of the Kishig, the imperial guard, and believe themselves to be the custodians of the Khan's burial site. They resist outside attempts to investigate, seeing such investigations as violations of sacred trust. This cultural and spiritual resistance has been in many ways more effective at protecting the Khan's tomb than any physical barrier could be. But modern technology has changed the equation. Beginning in the late 20th century and accelerating in the 21st century, new tools have become available that can investigate archaeological sites without requiring traditional excavation. Ground-penetrating radar, satellite imaging, magnetic field analysis, remote sensing technologies. All of these allow scientists to scan underground and hidden areas from a distance. They allow investigation without the kind of physical disturbance that would violate the spiritual prohibitions against excavation. They allow scientists to identify hidden chambers, buried structures, and underground anomalies that would be invisible to traditional archaeology. At the same time, there has been a shift in international attitudes toward Genghis Khan. Scholars have begun to recognize that his conquests, while involving tremendous violence, also facilitated unprecedented levels of cultural exchange, trade, and communication. Historians have begun to appreciate that the Mongol Empire, despite its brutality, created conditions for innovations and developments that would have been impossible in a world of isolated warring kingdoms. Scientists have become more interested in understanding Genghis Khan not as a simple villain or conqueror, but as a complex historical figure whose achievements and whose failures both deserve study and understanding. This scholarly reassessment has been reflected in Mongolia itself. While spiritual resistance to disturbance of sacred sites remains strong, there has emerged a growing recognition that uncovering Genghis Khan's tomb, if it could be done respectfully and scientifically, might provide valuable historical knowledge. The search for the tomb is no longer seen, by some Mongolians, as simple sacrilege, but as a legitimate historical investigation, provided that it is conducted with appropriate respect and that it follows cultural protocols and restrictions. In the 21st century, multiple expeditions have been launched to search for Genghis Khan's tomb. Some of these expeditions have been led by international teams of scientists. Some have been led by Mongolian researchers working with foreign collaborators. Some have been supported by television networks and documentaries interested in bringing the search to a wider audience. These expeditions have focused on the Khenti Mountains region, which seems most consistent with historical accounts and with local oral traditions. They have employed ground-penetrating radar, satellite imaging, and other advanced technologies to try to identify the location of the buried Khan. The results of these investigations have been tantalizing but not definitive. Some surveys have identified anomalies in the earth that could potentially be ancient burial sites. Some investigations have located areas that show evidence of having been deliberately concealed or protected. Some have found artifacts or evidence of human activity in certain regions that could potentially be consistent with a royal burial. But none of these investigations has yet produced absolute proof of the location of Genghis Khan's tomb. The tomb remains hidden. The mystery remains unsolved. One of the most significant recent developments has been the increased involvement of Mongolian archaeologists and researchers. Rather than being a search conducted by foreign expeditions against local wishes, the search for Genghis Khan's tomb has increasingly become a collaborative effort involving Mongolian scholars, Mongolian universities, and Mongolian cultural authorities. This shift has brought several advantages. It has allowed the search to proceed with greater cultural sensitivity. It has ensured that local knowledge, oral traditions, and spiritual concerns are taken into account. It has made it more likely that if the tomb is found, it will be treated with appropriate respect and incorporated into Mongolian cultural heritage in a way that honors the traditions of the Mongolian people. The question of what should be done if Genghis Khan's tomb is found remains open. Some scholars argue that the body should be subjected to DNA analysis to confirm its identity. Some argue that artifacts and burial goods should be scientifically documented. Some argue that the remains should be left untouched, that the spiritual wishes of the Khan should be respected by leaving the burial undisturbed. Some Mongolian spiritual leaders argue that if the tomb is found, it should be sealed again, that the knowledge of its location should not be publicized, that the sacred nature of the burial place should be maintained even in the modern era. The debate over what should be done with Genghis Khan's remains, if they are found, reflects a larger tension in modern archaeology. On one side are those who believe that scientific knowledge and historical understanding justify the examination of ancient remains, even when doing so violates the wishes or the spiritual beliefs of the deceased or of the descendants of the deceased. On the other side are those who believe that respect for the dead, respect for cultural traditions, and recognition of the spiritual significance of burial sites should limit scientific investigation, even when such limitations prevent us from learning things we might otherwise learn. In the case of Genghis Khan, this tension is particularly acute because of the explicit nature of the Khan's wishes regarding his burial. Unlike many ancient burials, where the wishes of the deceased are unknown or must be inferred from limited evidence, Genghis Khan's desire for a hidden burial is explicitly documented in historical sources. He deliberately ordered that his burial place be hidden. He deliberately ordered that it be protected. He deliberately created measures to ensure that it would remain secret. To violate this explicit wish, to uncover the tomb despite the Khan's clear instructions that it should remain hidden, raises questions about the ethics of archaeological investigation and the rights of the deceased. Yet at the same time, there is an undeniable human curiosity about Genghis Khan, about his life, about his achievements, about his legacy. The tomb, if found, would be one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the modern era. It would provide direct physical evidence about the Khan's life, his health, his physical characteristics. It might contain artifacts that would shed light on Mongol culture and practices. It might contain records or documents that would enhance our understanding of this crucial period in history. From a purely intellectual perspective, the discovery of the tomb would be enormously valuable. The search continues. In mountains and valleys of Mongolia, scientists and explorers continue to look for clues about where Genghis Khan was buried. They continue to search for anomalies in the earth, for hidden chambers, for physical evidence of an ancient burial. They continue to interview local residents, to examine historical documents, to refine theories about where the Khan might be. They continue to develop new technologies and new methodologies for detecting buried structures without physically disturbing them. And they continue to hope that one day, the mystery that has lasted for 800 years might finally be solved. In the mountains of Mongolia today, in a region that remains remote and difficult to access, archaeologists are conducting investigations that may finally be poised to solve one of the greatest mysteries in human history. The search has evolved dramatically from the tentative explorations of previous centuries. Where once researchers relied on intuition, oral tradition, and educated guessing, modern investigators now employ technologies that would have seemed miraculous to earlier generations. Satellites circling above the Earth are capturing images of terrain with a precision that would have been impossible just decades ago. Ground-penetrating radar systems are sending electromagnetic waves deep into the Earth and analyzing the reflections to create three-dimensional maps of underground structures. Magnetic field analysis is detecting disturbances in the Earth that might indicate buried objects or modified terrain. Drone surveillance is covering vast areas quickly, capturing details that would require months of ground-based exploration. And coordinating all of this data, sophisticated artificial intelligence algorithms are analyzing patterns, identifying anomalies, and highlighting areas that warrant further investigation. The current generation of searches for Genghis Khan's tomb represents a fundamental shift in approach. Rather than relying on excavation or physical disturbance of the landscape, modern investigators are attempting to locate the tomb through non-invasive means. They are trying to find it using technology that allows them to look through earth and stone without disturbing them. This approach has the advantage of respecting the spiritual concerns of Mongolian people who believe that excavation would be sacrilegious. It also has the advantage of being more efficient. A team with modern technology can survey in weeks what would have taken years with traditional archaeological methods. One of the most promising recent investigations has been conducted in collaboration between Mongolian and international researchers. In 2021 and 2022, a team led by researchers from multiple countries conducted a comprehensive survey of the Khenti Mountains region and surrounding areas. Using satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and other advanced technologies, they identified numerous sites of archaeological interest. Some of these sites showed evidence of ancient occupation. Some appeared to have been deliberately concealed. Some showed magnetic anomalies that could indicate buried structures of significant size. The survey did not definitively locate Genghis Khan's tomb, but it did identify several locations that warrant more intensive investigation. One particularly intriguing finding has been the identification of areas that appear to have been deliberately modified or disturbed in ancient times. These areas show evidence of soil disturbance patterns that could be consistent with the burial practices described in historical accounts. The patterns suggest that in these locations, earth was moved and soil structure was altered, then later restored to a natural appearance. This is precisely what would be expected if ancient workers, following Genghis Khan's instructions, had conducted a burial and then disguised the location to prevent it from being recognized. The locations identified are concentrated in specific areas that are consistent with descriptions in historical sources. Another significant development has been the involvement of Mongolian historians and archaeologists working with local communities. These researchers have been systematically collecting and documenting oral traditions about Genghis Khan's burial. They have interviewed elderly Mongolians who remember stories passed down through their families. They have examined local place names that might preserve ancient meanings. They have studied geographic features that might have been named in reference to the Khan's burial. This combination of modern technology and traditional knowledge has proven more effective than either approach alone. The involvement of local Mongolian researchers has also been crucial in navigating the cultural and political sensitivities surrounding the search. Some areas remain off-limits due to ongoing military or strategic concerns. Some areas are considered sacred and are off-limits for spiritual reasons. Some areas are privately owned and require permission from landowners for access. A research team composed partly of Mongolians has greater ability to navigate these complexities. They have greater cultural understanding of why certain areas are restricted. They have greater ability to negotiate with local authorities and spiritual leaders. They have greater credibility when explaining that the research is being conducted with proper respect for Mongolian culture and traditions. The research protocols developed for the search for Genghis Khan's tomb have also evolved. Rather than planning to excavate and examine remains if the tomb is found, researchers have developed a more respectful protocol. If the tomb is located, the initial step would be to document its location using non-invasive technologies. The location would then be reported to Mongolian cultural authorities and to spiritual leaders of the regions involved. Further investigation would only proceed if approved by these authorities. If remains are found, DNA analysis might be conducted if permission is granted, but only with the understanding that the remains would be reburied with appropriate respect. The goal is to solve the mystery, but to do so in a way that honors Genghis Khan's wishes to the greatest extent possible. This respectful approach has won support from many Mongolians who might otherwise have opposed the search. It demonstrates that international researchers understand and respect Mongolian culture and traditions. It demonstrates that the search is not being conducted out of mere curiosity or out of disrespect for the dead, but out of a genuine desire to understand history while maintaining appropriate respect. This cultural sensitivity has opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed. It has allowed researchers to access areas that might have been restricted to foreign teams operating without local cooperation. The technological investigations have also benefited from analysis of historical documents that had not been carefully studied in previous searches. In particular, researchers have examined detailed descriptions of the Mongol military organization and the routes that military units would have taken. They have analyzed the geographic knowledge of medieval chroniclers to determine what information would have been available to them. They have attempted to reconstruct, as accurately as possible, the route that the funeral cortege would have taken. By determining likely routes, researchers can narrow down the areas where the tomb is most likely to be located. This method of historical analysis, combined with technological investigation of the narrowed search area, has proven more effective than simply searching vast territories with new technology. One particularly interesting line of investigation has involved the analysis of satellite imagery from different time periods. By comparing satellite images from the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, and 2010s, researchers can identify areas where terrain has been altered, where vegetation patterns have changed, or where human activity has disturbed the landscape. Such changes might indicate that an area has been deliberately protected and maintained. They might indicate that local authorities have been taking steps to preserve a particular location. They might indicate that an area has been treated differently than surrounding areas, suggesting special significance. The analysis of these temporal changes in satellite imagery has identified several areas that show unusual patterns that could be significant. Another important development has been the involvement of international organizations and educational institutions. Universities from multiple countries have contributed expertise in various fields relevant to the search. Geologists have contributed knowledge of the region's geology and soil composition. Remote sensing experts have contributed expertise in interpreting satellite and radar data. Historians have contributed expertise in analyzing historical sources. Cultural anthropologists have contributed expertise in understanding Mongolian traditions and beliefs. This multidisciplinary approach has brought together knowledge from many different fields, all focused on the single objective of locating Genghis Khan's tomb. The search has also benefited from advances in understanding ancient burial practices. As archaeologists have excavated and studied burial sites from across Central Asia and the Eurasian steppes, they have developed a better understanding of how burials were conducted in this region. They understand the types of structures that might have been built to contain the remains. They understand the likely preservation conditions and how they affect the decay of organic materials. They understand the types of artifacts that would likely have been buried with someone of Genghis Khan's status. This improved understanding of burial practices helps guide the search. It helps researchers understand what physical signatures they should be looking for. It helps them evaluate whether sites identified through remote sensing might actually be burial sites or might be something else entirely. As of 2024 and early 2025, the search for Genghis Khan's tomb has reached a critical juncture. Multiple years of technological investigation have narrowed down the search area considerably. Research teams have identified several locations that show strong indicators of potentially being ancient burial sites. The accumulation of evidence from different sources, satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, magnetic field analysis, historical documents, local oral traditions, and analysis of burial practices is beginning to point toward a specific region or regions where the tomb is most likely to be located. What makes this moment particularly significant is that the search now appears to be approaching a point where more intensive investigation might be justified. The evidence has accumulated to the point where some researchers believe that excavation, if conducted very carefully and with appropriate permissions, might be warranted. The identification of likely locations means that if excavation does proceed, it would not involve vast areas being disturbed. Instead, it would focus on specific locations where evidence suggests the tomb might be located. This targeted approach would minimize environmental and cultural impact. However, the decision to proceed with excavation is not straightforward. It involves complex considerations of ethics, culture, and science. The Mongolian government must weigh the cultural value of maintaining respect for Genghis Khan's wishes against the scientific and historical value of potentially making a major archaeological discovery. The Mongolian people must decide whether they wish to have their greatest historical figure's tomb disturbed, even in the name of historical knowledge. International researchers must consider whether their desire to solve a mystery justifies potentially violating the explicit wishes of an ancient ruler. The debate has generated significant discussion in academic circles and in Mongolian society. Some scholars argue passionately that the potential historical knowledge to be gained from examining Genghis Khan's remains and burial site justifies excavation. They argue that such a discovery would be among the most significant archaeological finds in modern history. They argue that understanding Genghis Khan's life, health, and physical characteristics could contribute significantly to our understanding of this crucial historical period. They argue that the risks of desecration are minimal if excavation is conducted with appropriate care and respect. Others argue with equal passion that respect for the Khan's explicit wishes should take precedence. They argue that Genghis Khan deliberately requested that his burial place remain hidden, and that violating this request dishonors his memory. They argue that the spiritual concerns of the Mongolian people regarding sacred sites should take precedence over scientific curiosity. They argue that some mysteries are valuable precisely because they remain mysteries, that the legend of Genghis Khan is enhanced by the fact that his tomb remains lost, that solving the mystery might in some ways diminish rather than enhance our understanding of this great historical figure. This debate reflects fundamental questions about archaeology, about the relationship between the living and the dead, about the balance between scientific inquiry and cultural respect, about whose interests should take precedence when they conflict. These are questions that archaeology has grappled with for decades, particularly as the discipline has become more aware of issues related to cultural heritage, indigenous rights, and the respectful treatment of human remains. Regardless of the outcome of this debate, one thing is clear. The search for Genghis Khan's tomb has already provided valuable insights. The investigation of the Khenti Mountains region has identified numerous archaeological sites. It has contributed to our understanding of ancient settlement patterns in Mongolia. It has produced new knowledge about the geography and ecology of the region. It has fostered collaboration between Mongolian and international researchers. It has brought attention to Mongolian history and culture. Even if the specific location of Genghis Khan's tomb remains unknown, the search itself has been valuable. But there is something undeniably compelling about the possibility that the mystery might finally be solved. For 800 years, the question has remained unanswered. For 800 years, scholars and adventurers have speculated about where one of history's greatest figures lies buried. For 800 years, the legend has grown, feeding on mystery, sustained by the unknown. What would it mean if, in 2025 or 2026 or in the next few years, the question was finally answered? What would it mean to locate the remains of Genghis Khan, to verify his identity, to examine artifacts that had rested undisturbed for 8 centuries? Such a discovery would be transformative. It would provide direct physical evidence about the Khan, his health, his age at death, perhaps evidence of injuries or illnesses that affected him. It would potentially provide artifacts that could reveal information about Mongol culture and practices. It might provide written records or documents that could shed light on events of the early 13th century. It would settle questions that have been debated by historians and archaeologists for generations. It would answer one of the great unsolved mysteries of human history. Yet at the same time, there is something poignant about the possibility of solving the mystery. If Genghis Khan's tomb is found and opened, an 800-year-old secret will be violated. A boundary that has been protected with extraordinary dedication will be crossed. A command issued by the Khan himself, obeyed faithfully through 8 centuries of change and turmoil, will finally be broken. The legend will transform from something mysterious and transcendent into something concrete and definable. The Khan will cease to be a figure of pure history and pure mythology and become instead a collection of bones and artifacts. Some might argue that this transformation is necessary, that it represents progress in human knowledge, that it honors the Khan in a different way, not by respecting his wishes for secrecy, but by recognizing his historical importance enough to make him subject of the most sophisticated archaeological investigation of the modern era. Others would argue that the transformation represents a loss, that respecting the Khan's wishes even 800 years after his death is a form of respect that should take precedence, that not all mysteries need to be solved, that some secrets are worth keeping. As we stand at this juncture, as technology continues to advance, as research continues to progress, as the evidence continues to accumulate, The question is no longer whether Genghis Khan's tomb can be found. The question is now whether it should be found. The question is no longer a matter of capability, but of ethics and values. The question is no longer technical, but philosophical and cultural. In the mountains of Mongolia, in the valleys where Temujin was born, where he grew into Genghis Khan, where he became the greatest conqueror in human history, the secret remains. The grass grows, the wind blows, the seasons change. The tomb, if it is there, rests undisturbed, waiting. 800 years after the Khan's death, his final command is still being obeyed. His burial place remains hidden. His secret remains kept, but perhaps not for much longer. Perhaps in the coming years, with the advancing technology, with the accumulating evidence, with the narrowing search area, the mystery will finally be solved. Perhaps the greatest conqueror in history, who reshaped the world in his lifetime, who created an empire larger than any that had existed before, will finally be brought back from the darkness. Perhaps his remains will rest in a museum. Perhaps DNA analysis will confirm his identity. Perhaps artifacts will be scientifically documented. Perhaps the truth about Genghis Khan's death and burial will finally be known. Or perhaps the mystery will endure. Perhaps the Khan's security measures will prove so effective that even modern technology cannot penetrate them. Perhaps the location will remain hidden despite all our efforts. Perhaps Genghis Khan will achieve in death what he achieved in life. He will bend history to his will. He will remain in control even from beyond the grave, dictating how the world remembers him, maintaining his secrets even as civilizations rise and fall around him. One thing is certain: the search continues. Researchers are not giving up. Technology continues to advance. The mystery continues to fascinate. And in the hearts and minds of millions of people around the world, the question persists. Where is Genghis Khan? Where does the greatest conqueror in human history rest? What secrets does his tomb contain? When will the mystery finally be solved? Genghis Khan's tomb is out there. Somewhere beneath the Mongolian steppes, somewhere in the mountains that he knew as a young man, somewhere in the land of his birth, his remains are waiting. They have waited for 800 years. They continue to wait. And perhaps in the coming years they will finally be found. The man who conquered 40 of the world's population, who created an empire that stretched from the Pacific to the Black Sea, who transformed human history through his military genius and organizational vision, will finally reveal his final secret. The search for Genghis Khan's tomb is more than an archaeological investigation. It is a quest to understand one of the greatest figures in human history. It is an attempt to bridge the gap between legend and reality, between myth and history, between the stories we tell about the past and the truth that lies beneath. It is a search for knowledge, for understanding, for answers to questions that have puzzled humanity for 8 centuries. And it is a testament to human curiosity, human determination, and human refusal to accept that some mysteries must remain forever unsolved. The Khan is waiting. The search continues. And one day, perhaps, the greatest mystery in history will finally be revealed.